Well, hello and welcome to Atheism versus Logic. I hope you're having a good day. And I want to talk to you about blindfolds because I realized with the conversation with somebody on the internet, I was trying to explain to her, about some complex things that nature could never produce on its own. And she was telling me that complexity is not a sign of design. If someone designs something, they try to do it the simple way possible. And so, man, it just hit me that this is a blindfold that atheists have put on themselves, right? Because if you say complexity does not mean design, it has to be simple. And then if you saw that it was simple, you'd probably say it doesn't need to be designed. Do you understand that? So when I point out something complex, you protect yourself from the idea of God, and then anything simple, I'm not really pointing out anything simple. You would probably say, well, there is no need for God because it's simple. And so what I realized is that atheists are putting a blindfold on themselves. They're convincing themselves that the very thing that God is communicating to them with is not the thing. So if you imagine, you've got these noise canceling headphones. Well, imagine you could switch those to zone out one person. Right? And that's really what they're doing when they're saying complexity does not equal design. And then when we look in the cell and we look at protein synthesis, especially, and, they like, well, that's just too complex for it to be a creator. Isn't that crazy? I mean, think about that, saying that it's too complex to be a creator, right? What if you looked at everything else that way? You looked at cars and computers, your cell phone, just looking at anything complex and you're like, well, that clearly wasn't designed because it's too complex. I mean, that's silly. And then you've got this whole idea from Richard Dawkins about, and I assume it's him in The Selfish Gene. Somebody sent that to me and I read it yesterday, the chapter in his book on the selfish gene, which is old. I want to say it was published in the 70s. I want to say 73, but don't quote me on that. So you've got this idea of Richard Dawkins saying that as long as we have a self-replicating molecule, then that would lead to life. And I've heard people say that hey, once we get self-replication, that's it. It's done. I think that's clearly wrong. That's being said by people. Well, gosh, Richard Dawkins, it's just crazy because Richard Dawkins and Aaron Ra, I've watched Aaron Ra's videos. He's got videos on protein synthesis. These guys understand protein synthesis. So let me go over it again and try to help any of you that might be willing to take that blindfold off. So let me tell you again two analogies of protein synthesis. So protein synthesis is like having a computer with a 3D printer, but this 3D printer is amazing because it can make more computer parts, any computer part. But imagine you've got a computer with a 3D printer that's able to make more parts, right? All that's nothing without software. Do you agree with that? Computer hardware and a 3D printer is nothing without software. And that's what the genes are. The genes are the software telling the machinery, the proteins, what to make. So you need the two. And so think about that. If you have a self-replicating molecule, like Richard Dawkins wants to convince people could become life, it's typically either hardware or software. It's not both. And they haven't seen it, right? You ask scientists, they've never seen nucleotides accidentally arrange themselves into a functional gene, right? You've never seen computer software accidentally make itself, right? Same with hardware. They've never seen proteins, amino acids arrange themselves into functional sequences. All right, so study protein synthesis. Study what's going on inside of a cell. You've got proteins that you could equivalent to hardware, and you've got genes, which is equivalent to software. Well, you need them to work together. So what you're telling us by being an atheist and believing in unguided abiogenesis is you're telling me that the equivalent to computer software developed on its own inside a microscopic membrane. Remember, because if you get software 10 miles apart from hardware, it's not going to matter, right? Number one, nature cannot produce functional genes, aka software. Nature cannot produce functional hardware, aka proteins, right? So if it did do it, and it was even a foot apart on a planet, that doesn't matter. It's got to be inside the microscopic membrane. So you're telling me by being an atheist and believing in unguided abiogenesis that you believe nature was able to produce a miniature hardware microscopic hardware, including a 3D printer, which is the ribosome, able to make more hardware, and able to make the software, the genes, and get them to work together. Come on. Atheism is crazy. Take off your blindfold. All right. Take off your blindfold. You can be a deist. Remember, you don't have to accept crazy religions. So that's the first analogy. The next analogy, we'll talk about two different languages. So proteins are sequences of amino acids. Genes, made up of RNA and DNA. RNA is the copy of codes, sections, genes in the DNA. Well, that's made with nucleic acids or nucleotides. And so 3 of those are read and made into and one amino acid. So 3 nucleotides in the gene codes for 1 amino acid for the protein. So imagine you've got 2 monkeys typing side by side, right? And one produces a paragraph in English. Ooh. And the other one types the equivalent paragraph. It means the same exact thing, but in Chinese. How crazy would that be? But that's what you need inside of a cell. So if the cell could accidentally, if the replicator could accidentally produce the proteins necessary for the ribosome, which could create more proteins, well, those proteins wouldn't last unless the code for them was in the genes. And so that's like the English and the Chinese. So at the same time, nature would have to produce these functional proteins. Nature would have to also produce the functional code, the functional recipe for those proteins, and put them in the same microscopic membrane, remember? So if you had that functional protein over here, let's do a foot again. You had the functional ribosome. Let's say nature was accidentally able to make a functional ribosome. It would have to accidentally make the genes for those proteins for the ribosome and put them together so that the ribosome could keep making more ribosomes, right? Because if there's just one ribosome, which again, nature cannot produce a functional ribosome. But even if it did, it would have to produce the code so it could produce more of them. I don't know how many, but I think it was thousands. Like a living cell has thousands of these little protein making machines, these little mini 3D printers, if you will. So again, it would be like a monkey accidentally typing a functional paragraph in English, and then the monkey right beside it producing a functional, that same meaning functional paragraph, but in Chinese, because that's what you need. You need the code in the gene made of nucleotides, and 3 nucleotides is coded for 1 amino acid. So here's what you need to do. You're smart people, right? You can know God. You can know that God exists if you want to, but you're going to have to be honest with yourself. You're going to have to take off that blindfold, and you're going to have to study this on your own. So I hope this helps. I'm just going to keep speaking truth, whether you agree with me or not, because I know there's some people out there who will be logical, and they will be like, oh man, this guy is right. That is crazy to think that could come about by natural processes.